The jungle breathed with malevolent life as Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Smith pressed his binoculars against his sweat-stained face, watching the Japanese positions through the steaming New Guinea morning of November 16, 1942. What he saw made his blood run cold. Not just enemy fortifications, but death itself, perfectly engineered and waiting. The Battle of Buna-Gona would prove to be one of the most brutal and costly campaigns in the Pacific theater, a grinding nightmare that would shatter illusions about quick victory and easy conquest. Smith, commanding officer of the American 126th Infantry Regiment, had arrived expecting to face a demoralized enemy in retreat. Instead, he found himself staring at the most sophisticated defensive network the Japanese had yet constructed, and in the Pacific a labyrinth of concealed bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, and killing zones that would turn the approaching Allied advance into a months-long bloodbath. The strategic importance of the Buna-Gona area could not be overstated. These coastal settlements on New Guinea's northeastern shore represented Japan's last major foothold on the island, their final launching pad for potential attacks on Australia itself. General Douglas MacArthur had made their capture a priority, believing that swift action could crush Japanese resistance before they could further entrench themselves. The reality would prove devastatingly different. Major General Edwin Harding's 3rd 2nd Infantry Division had been hastily transported from Australia, many of his men seasoned only in training, not combat. They joined forces with battle-hardened Australian units under Lieutenant General Edmund Herring, veterans of the grueling Kokoda Track campaign who had already pushed the Japanese back from the very gates of Port Moresby. The alliance represented more than military necessity. It embodied the shared determination of two nations to halt Japanese expansion in the Pacific. As Smith surveyed the terrain ahead, he could see why the Japanese had chosen this ground so carefully. The coastal plains stretched before them, seemingly open but deceptively treacherous. Hidden beneath the canopy of coconut palms and dense tropical vegetation lay a network of log and earth bunkers, each positioned to provide mutual support and overlapping fire coverage. The Japanese had transformed every natural feature into a weapon. Fallen logs became machine gun nests, drainage ditches became communication trenches, and innocent-looking grass huts concealed deadly firing positions. According to military historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's detailed account in The Struggle for Guadalcanal, the Japanese defensive preparations at Buna-Gona represented a quantum leap in Pacific fortification techniques. The enemy they faced was not the retreating rabble MacArthur's intelligence had suggested, but elite troops of the Japanese South Seas Detachment under Colonel Yoshitatsu Yokoyama. These were the same soldiers who had conquered Hong Kong and stormed through the Dutch East Indies with seemingly unstoppable momentum. Now, cornered and desperate, they had months to prepare their final stand, and they had used every day wisely. Smith lowered his binoculars and turned to Captain James Morton, his operations officer. The younger man's face showed the strain that all felt, the weight of impending battle, the humidity that sapped strength even before combat began, and the growing realization that their intelligence estimates had been catastrophically wrong. The morning air carried the acrid smell of credite from sporadic sniper fire and the sweet, cloying scent of tropical flowers that would soon be trampled under advancing boots and falling bodies. In the distance, the rhythmic pounding of surf against the beach provided a deceptively peaceful counterpoint to the tension building among the Allied forces. Soon, that same beach would echo with the screams of wounded men and the crack of rifle fire. Dawn on November 19, 1942, broke gray and oppressive over the Buna coast as Colonel Smith's 126th Infantry Regiment prepared for their first major assault. The men had spent the previous night in fitful sleep, their uniforms already soaked with perspiration despite the early hour. What lay ahead would transform these citizen soldiers into veterans. If they survived the next few hours, the attack began at 0600 hours with a pathetic artillery barrage that seemed to mock the magnitude of what the infantry was about to face. The Allies had precious few heavy guns in this theater, and those they possessed lacked the shells needed for proper preparation. The Japanese bunkers, constructed with 3-foot-thick logs and reinforced with steel plates salvaged from wrecked ships, absorbed the light bombardment with contemptuous ease. As the last shells fell, an ominous silence settled over the battlefield, broken only by the distant cry of tropical birds and the nervous shuffling of American boots in the mud. When the whistle blew, Smith's men rose from their positions and advanced across the open ground in textbook formation, their officers having trained them for conventional warfare against conventional enemies. What they encountered instead was a masterpiece of defensive engineering. That turned their training into a liability and their courage into a death sentence. The first indication of catastrophe came not with the roar of machine guns, but with an almost casual popping sound, Japanese snipers picking off officers and sergeants with methodical precision. Then, as the advancing Americans reached the invisible line the defenders had predetermined, hell erupted from every direction simultaneously. Hidden machine gun nests opened fire in perfectly coordinated volleys, their interlocking fields creating killing zones from which there was no escape. Mortars began dropping shells with devastating accuracy, their crews having prearranged every inch of the approach routes during months of preparation. Private Tommy Chen, a 19-year-old from California's Central Valley, found himself pinned behind a fallen coconut palm as bullets snapped overhead. With the sound of angry wasps around him, his platoon was being systematically destroyed by enemies they could not see, could barely locate, and seemed impossible to suppress. The Japanese bunkers had been designed with multiple firing ports, allowing defenders to shift positions instantly when return fire came their way. What appeared to be a single machine gun position might house 3 or 4 weapons, each ready to take up the fight when another was forced to cease fire. Captain Morton, advancing with the second wave, watched in horror as the carefully planned assault devolved into chaos. His radio crackled with desperate calls for medical assistance, artillery support, and reinforcements, but there was precious little of any to give. The Japanese had achieved something remarkable. They had created a defensive system so efficient that they could inflict maximum casualties while conserving their own strength, bleeding the attackers white while remaining relatively secure in their positions. The Australian forces attacking the Gona positions 5 miles to the southeast were experiencing their own nightmare. Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honnor's 39th Battalion, veterans of the Kokoda track fighting, found themselves facing similar defensive sophistication. The Japanese had learned from every previous Pacific battle, incorporating lessons from Guadalcanal and earlier New Guinea fighting into an almost perfect killing machine. By noon, the assault had ground to a bloody halt. Smith's regiment had advanced less than 200 yards and suffered over 30% casualties, with many of their most experienced non-commissioned officers among the dead and wounded. The men lay scattered across the battlefield, some dead, others wounded and crying for medics who could not reach them under the withering fire, and still others simply paralyzed by the intensity of combat for which nothing had prepared them. The Japanese, meanwhile, remained largely untouched in their bunkers, their ammunition carefully conserved, their positions intact, and their confidence growing with each failed Allied assault. They had achieved the tactical miracle of modern offensive warfare, maximum effect with minimal exposure, grinding down a numerically superior enemy through superior preparation and positioning. As darkness fell on that first day, the sobering reality became clear to every Allied commander involved. This would not be the swift victory MacArthur had promised, but a prolonged nightmare that would test every man's courage and every leader's skill. The morning of November 22nd dawned with the stench of death already settling over the battlefield like a suffocating blanket. 3 days of failed assaults had taught Colonel Smith a bitter lesson about modern warfare, that courage alone could not overcome properly prepared defensive positions, and that his men were paying the price for their commander's underestimation of Japanese military engineering. Smith stood in what had once been a plantation manager's office, now serving as his forward command post, studying maps that seemed to mock him with their neat lines and confident arrows. The reality outside bore no resemblance to the clean tactical problems he had studied at Fort Leavenworth. Every yard of ground between his position and the Japanese bunkers had become a killing field. Lieutenant Robert Hayes, barely 22 years old and now commanding what remained of Baker Company after his captain had been killed on the first day, entered the command post with the hollow-eyed look that was becoming common among the survivors. His company had started the campaign with 147 men. After 3 days of fighting, he could muster fewer than 60 effective soldiers, and even those were showing signs of the psychological strain that would later be recognized as combat fatigue. "Sir," Hayes reported, his voice hoarse from shouting orders over gunfire, "we've located what appears to be the main bunker complex about 300 yards northeast of our current position. The Japanese have it connected to at least 6 subsidiary positions by covered trenches. Every time we suppress one firing point, another opens up from a different angle." The tactical problem facing the Allies was unprecedented in their experience. Traditional infantry tactics called for suppressing enemy positions with artillery, then advancing under cover of that fire to close with the enemy. But the Japanese bunkers were virtually impervious to the light artillery available, and the dense jungle canopy made air support nearly impossible. Worse, the defenders had created a defensive system that was greater than the sum of its parts. Each bunker supported the others, creating a web of mutual protection that made isolated attacks futile. Military historian Robert Ross Smith noted in the approach to the Philippines that the Buna-Gona campaign represented the first time Allied forces encountered the sophisticated bunker systems that would characterize Japanese defensive tactics throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. Meanwhile, 5 miles to the southeast, the Australian forces under Lieutenant Colonel Honor were facing their own version of the same nightmare at Gona. The Japanese had fortified the old Anglican mission station with the same meticulous care, turning the peaceful compound where missionaries had once taught local children into a fortress that seemed impregnable to conventional assault. The Australians, despite their experience in jungle warfare, were discovering that experience meant little. When facing an entirely new form of defensive architecture, the human cost was becoming staggering. Field hospitals established just behind the front lines were overwhelmed with casualties, many suffering from wounds unlike anything the medical staff had encountered. The Japanese, with months to prepare, had positioned their weapons to cause maximum damage to attacking infantry. Machine guns were sighted to create grazing fire that would wound rather than kill outright, knowing that wounded men required more resources to handle than dead ones, and created greater psychological impact on their comrades. Private Chen, who had survived the first day's assault by what he considered a miracle, found himself part of a small reconnaissance patrol tasked with identifying Japanese positions for a planned night attack. As they crawled forward through the darkness, the jungle around them seemed alive with menace. Every shadow could conceal a sniper, every rustle of leaves might herald a grenade attack, and the constant awareness that they were moving through terrain the enemy had studied and prepared for months created a psychological pressure unlike anything they had experienced. The patrol's mission exemplified the fundamental problem facing Allied forces. They were fighting blind against an enemy that could see everything. The Japanese had used their preparation time not just to build bunkers, but to study every approach route, every piece of cover, every tactical option available to attackers. They knew exactly where Allied forces would have to go and what they would have to do, while the Americans and Australians were discovering these facts through bitter experience, one casualty at a time. By the end of November 22nd, it had become clear that the campaign would require a fundamental change in tactics, equipment, and expectations. The quick victory MacArthur had promised would have to be replaced with a methodical, costly grinding campaign that would test the resolve of every man involved. The alliance between American and Australian forces at Buna-Gona was forged not in diplomatic halls or strategic conferences, but in the shared misery of jungle combat and the mutual recognition that survival depended on cooperation. By November 26, 1942, the artificial distinctions between the two armies had begun dissolving under the pressure of a common enemy who treated all Allied soldiers with equal lethality. Lieutenant Colonel Smith found himself working more closely with his Australian counterpart, Lieutenant Colonel Honor, than he had with some of his own regimental commanders. The two men had developed a working relationship born of necessity and mutual respect, sharing intelligence, coordinating attacks, and most importantly, learning from each other's hard-won tactical insights. The Australians brought months of jungle fighting experience from the Kokoda track, while the Americans contributed fresh manpower and different perspectives on the seemingly impossible tactical problems they all faced. The cultural differences that might have seemed significant in peacetime became irrelevant. Under combat conditions, Australian slang mixed with American profanity in the foxholes, and men from farms in Iowa found themselves fighting alongside sheep station workers from Queensland, united by the simple desire to stay alive and accomplish their mission. The Japanese, in their tactical sophistication, had inadvertently created a brotherhood between forces that might otherwise have maintained polite but distant relationships. Captain Morton, now effectively commanding a combined American-Australian company after casualties had forced unit consolidation, discovered that the Australians' approach to jungle warfare differed significantly from American doctrine. Where American training emphasized overwhelming firepower and direct assault, the Australians had learned to use patience, stealth, and intimate knowledge of terrain. These lessons, purchased with blood on the Kokoda track, were now being shared with their American allies in the most direct way possible. Through combat example, the tactical innovations emerging from this cooperation were remarkable. Small mixed units began conducting night infiltration missions, that neither army had attempted independently. Australian expertise in silent movement combined with American firepower created reconnaissance patrols that could get closer to Japanese positions than either force had managed alone. More importantly, the shared intelligence gathered by these joint operations was giving Allied commanders their first clear picture of the defensive network they faced. Sergeant William Thompson, a regular Army veteran from the Australian 39th Battalion, found himself leading a patrol that included 3 Americans, 2 Papua New Guinea natives serving as scouts, and a British intelligence officer who had somehow attached himself to the unit. This multinational force represented something entirely new in Pacific warfare, a truly integrated combat team that drew strength from its diversity, rather than suffering from lack of coordination. The patrol's mission was to locate the command bunker complex that Allied intelligence suspected lay at the heart of the Japanese defensive network. Moving through the jungle at night required skills none of the Americans possessed initially, but Thompson's patient teaching and their own desperate need to learn created rapid improvement. The Americans, in turn, brought different perspectives on tactical problems and equipment uses that sometimes revealed solutions the Australians had overlooked. According to the official Australian Army history, the final campaigns, the Buna-Gona battle, marked the beginning of true tactical integration between Allied forces in the Pacific, lessons that would prove invaluable in later campaigns. The Japanese defenders, meanwhile, were experiencing their own challenges. Colonel Yokoyama's forces, while superbly prepared for defense, were beginning to feel the strain of constant pressure from multiple directions. Their ammunition, carefully hoarded for months, was being expended at rates higher than anticipated due to the persistent Allied attacks. More critically, their supplies could not be easily replenished, with Allied air power beginning to interdict Japanese supply lines. The breakthrough came not from any single brilliant tactical innovation, but from the gradual accumulation of small advantages gained through Allied cooperation. Australian patience combined with American aggression, shared intelligence that painted an increasingly complete picture of enemy positions, and the development of new small unit tactics that exploited weaknesses in the Japanese defensive system. By late November, the character of the battle was beginning to shift. What had started as a series of bloody frontal assaults was evolving into a more sophisticated campaign of infiltration, bypass, and isolated reduction of strong points. The price remained terrible. Casualties continued to mount on both sides, but for the first time since the battle began, Allied commanders could see the possibility of eventual victory. The partnership between American and Australian forces at Buna-Gona would serve as a model for future Pacific operations, demonstrating that effective cooperation required more than shared objectives. It demanded mutual respect, tactical flexibility, and the willingness to learn from allies who brought different strengths to the common fight. December 1st, 1942, marked a subtle but crucial shift in the Battle of Buna-Gona as Allied forces finally began implementing lessons learned through weeks of costly trial and error. The transformation was not dramatic. No single engagement turned the tide, but rather a gradual evolution in tactics that began to neutralize Japanese defensive advantages and exploit weaknesses that had taken weeks to identify and understand. Colonel Smith, now commanding a combined American-Australian force after casualties had necessitated unit consolidation, stood in his command post studying aerial photographs that told a story of incremental progress. Red pins marked Japanese positions that had been identified and confirmed. Blue arrows showed successful infiltration routes discovered by night patrols, and yellow highlights indicated supply lines that had been cut or interdicted. For the first time since the battle began, the map showed more Allied knowledge than Japanese mystery. The breakthrough had come through the development of what would later be called bunker warfare, specialized tactics designed specifically for reducing fortified positions in jungle terrain. Small teams of volunteers, usually consisting of 4 to 6 men, would approach Japanese bunkers through carefully scouted routes during pre-dawn hours, carrying shaped charges, flamethrower fuel, and demolition equipment. These teams represented the best of both Allied forces, Australian stealth and navigation skills, combined with American engineering expertise and firepower. Sergeant Thompson, now leading one of these specialized assault teams, had developed techniques that would be studied and replicated throughout the Pacific theater. His team's approach to bunker reduction combined careful reconnaissance, coordinated supporting fire, and precisely timed demolition charges that could collapse even the most heavily reinforced positions. The key was patience, spending days studying each target, identifying blind spots in defensive coverage, and timing attacks to coincide with natural camouflage provided by tropical rainstorms. The psychological impact of these successful attacks was as important as their tactical effect. Japanese defenders, who had grown confident in their impregnable positions, were discovering that their bunkers could be penetrated and destroyed by determined attackers using proper techniques. More importantly, Allied soldiers were finally achieving victories that proved Japanese defensive positions were not invulnerable, rebuilding morale that had been severely damaged by weeks of failed assaults. Lieutenant Hayes, whose company had been decimated in the first week of fighting, found himself commanding a rebuilt unit that bore little resemblance to the Green soldiers, who had landed at Buna weeks earlier. His men moved with the careful precision of veterans, spoke in the abbreviated tactical language that develops among combat soldiers, and possessed the hard-won wisdom that comes from surviving extended close combat. They had learned to read the jungle, to distinguish between natural sounds and potential threats, and most importantly, to work together with deadly efficiency. The Japanese, however, were far from defeated. Colonel Yokoyama's forces had adapted to Allied tactical changes with their own innovations, creating mobile reserve forces that could counterattack whenever a bunker was overrun, and developing new camouflage techniques that made their positions even more difficult to locate. The defensive network, while damaged, remained formidable, and Japanese soldiers continued to fight with the desperate courage of men who knew retreat was impossible. Historian Stanley Fogg noted in Bataan, The March of Death, that the tactical evolution at Buna-Gona demonstrated how warfare could change rapidly when both sides were forced to innovate under combat pressure, creating new doctrines that would influence military thinking for decades. The most significant development was the improvement in Allied coordination between ground forces, and supporting arms. Artillery, while still limited, was being used more effectively through better communication with forward observers and more precise targeting of identified Japanese positions. Close air support, initially hampered by jungle canopy and lack of clear targets, had evolved to include low-level attacks on suspected bunker complexes and interdiction of Japanese supply routes. Private Chen, now a battle-tested veteran despite his young age, led scouting missions that provided crucial intelligence for these supporting attacks. His ability to move silently through jungle terrain had been developed through weeks of necessity, and his skill at identifying Japanese positions from minimal visual clues had made him invaluable to his unit. The transformation from frightened recruit to seasoned combat soldier exemplified the brutal education that was changing every man involved in the campaign. December 5th brought the first significant Japanese withdrawal, as defenders abandoned several outlying positions that had become untenable. Under constant Allied pressure, the retreat was tactical. Rather than strategic, Japanese forces were consolidating into stronger defensive positions, closer to the coast, but it represented the first time since the battle began that Allied forces were advancing rather than merely surviving. The momentum was building, slowly but unmistakably. Each successful bunker assault revealed new information about Japanese defensive systems. Each night patrol discovered new infiltration routes, and each day of combat produced small tactical innovations that improved Allied effectiveness. The terrible price in casualties continued, but for the first time, those casualties were achieving meaningful progress toward ultimate victory. By December 15th, 1942, the Battle of Buna-Gona had transformed into a methodical campaign of attrition that tested every aspect of military leadership, soldier endurance, and national will. The Japanese defensive network, while still formidable, was beginning to show cracks under relentless Allied pressure. But Colonel Yokoyama's forces remained determined to exact the highest possible price. For every yard of ground surrendered, Colonel Smith, now commanding the consolidated Allied force approaching the main Japanese stronghold at Buna, faced a tactical problem that would have seemed impossible. Months earlier, his combined American-Australian units had developed into a sophisticated fighting machine capable of complex operations. But the final Japanese positions represented the strongest link in a defensive chain that had already proven devastatingly effective. Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese had concentrated their best troops, heaviest weapons, and largest ammunition reserves in these final positions, preparing for a last stand that would make previous fighting seem like mere skirmishes. The Allied assault plan reflected weeks of hard-won tactical wisdom. Rather than attempting another frontal attack, Smith's forces would implement a coordinated series of infiltrations, diversions, and concentrated attacks designed to overwhelm Japanese defensive coordination. Australian units would conduct night infiltrations to identify and mark key defensive positions. American forces would provide the main assault element with concentrated firepower support, and specialized demolition teams would target bunker complexes that had been precisely located. Through patient reconnaissance, Sergeant Thompson's assault team, now veteran bunker specialists whose techniques were being studied by Allied commanders throughout the Pacific, received the mission of neutralizing what intelligence had identified as the Japanese command complex. The target was a heavily fortified position built around a concrete foundation, probably the remnants of a pre-war plantation building that had been enhanced with log and steel reinforcement and connected to surrounding positions by covered trenches. Destroying this position would require not just tactical skill, but extraordinary courage and precise execution under the most dangerous conditions imaginable. The assault began at 0400 hours on December 18th, with the most intensive artillery barrage Allied forces had yet managed to organize. Every available gun, mortar, and rocket launcher concentrated fire on identified Japanese positions for 30 minutes, creating a thunderous cacophony that could be heard miles away. The bombardment served multiple purposes, suppressing Japanese defensive fire, masking the sound of infiltrating Allied soldiers, and hopefully disrupting enemy communications at the crucial moment when coordination would be most important. Private Chen, now leading his own reconnaissance team, had spent the previous 3 days mapping Japanese positions with a methodical precision that had become his trademark. His intelligence reports provided the targeting information that made the artillery barrage possible, and his continued observation during the bombardment would help adjust fire and identify any defensive positions that survived the initial attack. The young soldier who had cowered behind a coconut palm during the first day's assault had evolved into one of the most valuable intelligence assets in the Allied force. When the artillery ceased, the jungle seemed to exhale in momentary silence before erupting into the most intense small arms combat of the entire campaign. Japanese defenders, despite the bombardment, were still capable of coordinated resistance. But Allied attackers were no longer the green soldiers who had stumbled into killing zones weeks earlier. They moved with the deadly precision of veterans, using every piece of cover, coordinating their movements with practiced efficiency, and demonstrating the tactical innovations that had been purchased with so much blood. Lieutenant Hayes, whose rebuilt company spearheaded the main assault, led his men through defensive positions that would have seemed impregnable when the battle began. But weeks of combat had taught them to read the tactical situation, to identify weaknesses in defensive arrangements, and most importantly, to trust in their own abilities and their comrades' support. The lieutenant, who had been overwhelmed by his first experience of combat, now moved with the confident authority of a seasoned combat leader. According to historian Samuel Milner's Victory in Papua, the final assault at Buna demonstrated how combat experience could transform military units, creating tactical effectiveness that no amount of peacetime training could duplicate. The Japanese resistance was fierce and skillful, but it lacked the coordinated precision that had characterized earlier defensive efforts. Weeks of constant pressure had degraded Japanese communications, reduced ammunition supplies, and most critically, eliminated many of the experienced junior leaders who had made their defensive system so effective. Individual Japanese soldiers continued to fight with desperate courage, but they could no longer coordinate their efforts with the devastating efficiency that had made their positions seem invulnerable. Thompson's assault team reached the command bunker complex as dawn was breaking, revealing the full extent of Japanese defensive preparations. The position was even more formidable than intelligence had suggested, with multiple firing ports, carefully designed killing zones, and backup positions that could cover any approach route. But the sergeant and his men had developed techniques for dealing with exactly this type of target, and they possessed the experience, equipment, and determination necessary to complete their mission. The assault on the command complex became a microcosm of the entire campaign. Individual courage overcoming defensive advantages through superior tactics, better coordination, and the accumulated wisdom of weeks of combat experience. The morning of December 22nd, 1942, dawned gray in humid over positions that had finally fallen silent. After weeks of continuous combat, Colonel Smith walked through the captured Japanese defensive network at Buna, his boots crunching on spent cartridge cases and debris that told the story of one of the most brutal campaigns in Pacific War history. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life, not just the evidence of enemy resistance, but the terrible price his own forces had paid for victory. The Japanese bunker system, now revealed in its full complexity, represented military engineering of the highest order. Concrete 10 log bunkers connected by Communication trenches, multiple firing positions with interlocking fields of fire, supply caches hidden throughout the defensive network, and escape routes that would have allowed defenders to withdraw and re-establish resistance elsewhere had they chosen retreat over annihilation. Every position had been sited with mathematical precision to maximize defensive effectiveness while minimizing exposure to counterattack. The Japanese had created a fortress that should have been impregnable by any conventional assault. Sergeant Thompson, whose bunker assault techniques had proved crucial in the final breakthrough, surveyed the command complex his team had finally captured after 3 days of close combat. The position had been defended to the very end, with Japanese soldiers fighting from individual positions. Even after their coordinated defense had collapsed, the evidence of their final resistance lay scattered throughout the complex empty ammunition boxes, improvised weapons, and the personal effects of men who had chosen death over surrender. The sergeant felt no satisfaction in victory, only the weary relief of survival and the sobering awareness of what such victories cost. The casualty figures from the Battle of Buna-Gona would shock Allied commanders and reshape tactical thinking throughout the Pacific theater. American forces had suffered over 3,000 casualties, including 800 killed in action, from units that had numbered fewer than 10,000 men at the campaign's start. Australian losses were proportionally similar, with some units suffering casualty rates approaching 70%. The Japanese had achieved their tactical objective of making victory as costly as possible, even though they had ultimately failed in their strategic mission of holding their defensive positions. Lieutenant Hayes, one of the few company-grade officers to survive the entire campaign, found himself commanding a unit that bore little resemblance to the company he had inherited weeks earlier. Of the original roster, fewer than 30 men remained unwounded, and most of those showed the psychological strain that would later be recognized as combat fatigue. Yet these survivors represented something unprecedented in American military experienced soldiers, who had learned to fight and win against the most sophisticated defensive systems their enemies could devise. Private Chen, now wearing sergeant's stripes earned through combat leadership rather than time in service, led burial details that provided the final accounting of the campaign's human cost. The young soldier, who had been terrified by his first encounter with combat, had evolved into a veteran whose skills and judgment were valued by commanders and respected by his peers. His transformation exemplified the brutal education that had changed every man who survived the campaign, creating soldiers whose tactical knowledge had been purchased with blood and whose combat effectiveness would prove crucial in future Pacific operations. The strategic implications of the Battle of Buna-Gona extended far beyond the immediate tactical victory. Allied forces had demonstrated that Japanese defensive positions, no matter how well prepared, but they had also learned that such victories required different tactics, better preparation, and more sophisticated coordination between arms and services than had been previously understood. Military historian Robert Ross Smith concluded in his comprehensive study that Buna-Gona represented a watershed moment in Pacific warfare, establishing tactical and operational precedents that would influence American and Australian military doctrine throughout the remainder of the conflict. The victory at Buna-Gona secured New Guinea's Papuan Peninsula for the Allies and eliminated the last major Japanese threat to Australia itself, but more importantly, it had forged a combat partnership between American and Australian forces that would prove invaluable in future operations. The shared experience of jungle combat against a sophisticated enemy had created mutual respect and understanding that transcended national differences and would facilitate cooperation throughout the remaining Pacific campaigns. As Smith filed his final report on the campaign, he reflected on the transformation his forces had undergone. They had arrived as soldiers trained for conventional warfare against conventional enemies. They were departing as veterans of jungle combat who understood how to fight and defeat the most determined and skillful opponents they would face in the Pacific theater. The price had been terrible, but the lessons learned at Buna-Gona would save lives and win battles in campaigns yet to come. The Battle of Buna-Gona was over, but its legacy would endure throughout the Pacific War and beyond, remembered not just as a victory, but as a testament to the courage of soldiers and the terrible price of defeating a determined enemy on ground of his own choosing.